Okay, hello folks. Welcome to another session of PHI 240. We are getting started on a new unit, which will be our last unit for the course, and which was the unit that y'all chose through voting on the variety of topics that I offered you as options for our last topic. So we are going to be talking about capital punishment and the death penalty. So, without any further ado, let's get to work. First thing to point out is just that when we're dealing with contentious issues in practical ethics, I think it's a really important thing for us to get our facts right. We don't want a philosophical or ethical discussion to just devolve into an argument about whether my facts can beat up your facts, as it were. It's often a good thing for both parties to a debate to get clear on a certain kind of common ground, right? Sort of a shared set of knowledge that you can both agree on. Because the more productive and philosophically interesting thing we can do is try to get clear on some facts we can agree on, because then we can really dig down to the tough philosophical issues. The other thing is when we're trying to figure out which facts we should trust, you should find the best sources that you can. When you cite a comprehensive study, that's going to be a good thing, especially, but most importantly, when it's from a peer-reviewed journal. Government sources can be good things, but then after that, it gets a little dicier. Non-scientific publications shouldn't be your source for scientific claims. You should avoid using Wikipedia when possible, although it can be a good place to look up a quick piece of information if you need to, or it can also be a good place to get started on your sources. But the main thing is that when we have these contentious debates, if we're going to have strong views, the thing that we want to do is back our claims up with facts, right? So we want to be like the credible Hulk, as it were. The credible Hulk always backs up his rage with well-documented sources. So when we get started talking about the death penalty, it's just going to be really important to start from a good common ground of facts we can all agree on, so we can then start to have a serious discussion about the ethical implications of those facts that we're all reasoning from. So some of the sources that I've looked at to give you some facts. So there's the Death Penalty Information Center. Now, they are an opinionated source because they tend to disfavor the practice of the death penalty. But they've done their work. They've done their homework. And that's information that we can trust. I also pulled some information out of your textbook, Living Ethics by Russ Schaefer Landau. And I've also got some information from Professors Borger and Una, who work at UNC Chapel Hill. Again, if we go to our best scientific sources, that can be a good way to just make sure that we're having a productive debate. So that's what I want to do in this video, is just walk you through some of the possibly ethically important considerations about the death penalty, both its history and its practice. So here are some basic facts. It is legal in 31 states and illegal in 19, plus DC. There's two kinds of crimes in the U.S. for which a person is liable to be sentenced to death. Murder, as well as crimes against the state. So, for instance, there have been a small handful of cases of people sentenced to death for treason. The most prominent case I can think of was in the 1960s when the Rosenbergs, I believe it's Ethel and David Rosenberg, were sentenced to death and executed for sharing secret state facts with the Soviet Union. But most all cases of the death penalty have involved murders, and the death penalty as a punishment for those. So here's how the practice of capital punishment is usually practiced. It works by injecting sodium thiopental into a patient. That will cause, or the patient, maybe we should use the victim as our word here, but sodium thiopental causes them to lose consciousness. Once they are into a coma, they're injected with pancuronium bromide, a muscle relaxant. And then the last drug, potassium chloride, disrupts the electrical signals in the heart, which causes cardiac arrest and kills them. From first injection to death, it takes about 5 minutes. Now, if you want to get some more information on the death penalty, you can also go to this PDF on the Death Penalty Information Center's website, and they give a breakdown of how many executions have happened, races of victims, and so forth. I believe it's somewhere on this chart. It discusses methods as well. So not everybody is executed according to lethal injection. So yeah, actually right here, we see that 1337 have died by lethal injection since the reinstitution of the death penalty in the 1970s. But there have been a handful of cases involving a gas chamber hanging firing squad. And then a not insignificant number also executed via electrocution. So we can see that there's good information out there about how capital punishment is actually practiced if you seek that information. So moving on. The United States has executed 14,500 murderers between 1976 and 2017. And as we just saw, most were done by lethal injection. In 2009, the number of executions was only 52. And the number of executions has been declining ever since. And there's a significant number of prisoners on death row, which means they have been sentenced to death, but they have not yet been executed. So they may be, say, appealing their sentence. And it's very possible that many of these 2,600 people will die in prison ultimately, given that only about 52 executions a year are happening at this rate. In 1972, the death penalty was ruled unconstitutional because the Supreme Court found that the death penalty was being applied in arbitrary and discriminatory ways. They basically told the states, you have to figure out a better way to do this if you're going to keep doing it. So by 1976, states began instructing juries with certain kinds of objective criteria for when to and when to not issue the death penalty. Some North North Carolina related facts because of where we're studying. So since it was reinstituted in North Carolina in 1977, only 43 people have been executed in the state of North Carolina, and there have been no executions since 2006. And during the sentencing process in the state of North Carolina, if there's a hung jury, which means some members of the jury disagree with the sentence being applied, capital punishment will not be allowed. So another way of putting that is that unless there is unanimous consent to capital punishment, it will not be given as a sentence. In a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, it found that in 1977, 144 people sentenced to death have been exonerated. And the study further estimates that only half of innocent people are actually exonerated. So the idea is, if we exonerated 144, that means that there were approximately 288 innocent people who have been sentenced to death since 1977. So by these numbers, remember working it out that about 1,500 or 1,600 executions have been performed since 1977. That means 288 out of about 1,500 have been innocent. So by these numbers, about 1 out of every 25 people sentenced to death did not actually commit the crime that they have been sentenced to death for. So yeah, about 4% of, let's say, people on death row did not, in fact, commit the crimes that they did. Or they did not commit the crimes that they have been sentenced to death for. A comprehensive study of the death penalty in North Carolina found that the odds of receiving a death sentence rose by about 3.5 times among those criminals with victims who were white. So that was the study done by a couple of profs at the University of North Carolina. So there is a certain kind of racial inequity in terms of who juries deem to have committed a crime so heinous that it merits the death penalty. Apparently, black victims are less likely to cause a murderer to be sentenced to death. So that's something to consider. And I'll just give you 2 more anecdotal facts. Now, these are actually facts that I just pulled off of Wikipedia. If you were writing about these anecdotes in a term paper, I would recommend that you follow up the sources cited on the Wikipedia page, and that will usually just do you fine. So you could probably cite both of these claims by looking at newspaper articles or even popular press books that are not published by, say, a university press. So these are just 2 anecdotal cases. One case is the case of John Wayne Gacy. He was executed in Illinois in 1994 after having spent 14 years on death row. So he was sentenced to death in 1980 for raping, murdering, and torturing at least 33 teenage boys between 72 and 78. Gacy was a diagnosed psychopath. He apparently had no empathy, and by the end of his life, apparently no remorse. It's been reported that his final words before his execution to the jailers was, "Kiss my ass." So this is a case of somebody who commits extremely heinous crimes, spends 14 years on death row, and who is then completely unrepentant, and there's nothing learned here. We can contrast this with a Canadian case. So the harshest sentence for committing a murder in Canada, a country where the death penalty is not legal anywhere, it's life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. And then after 25 years, there's a possibility that a murderer might be released from prison if they show considerable improvement and considerable remorse. They're unlikely to be released if they don't show good behavior and remorse. Moreover, the worse their crimes, the less likely it is that they will ever be released from prison. But for instance, Canada's worst serial killer, Robert Pickton, he was arrested in 2002, and he was charged with 26 murders. But based on the number of women who have been missing in the Vancouver area, as well as some of the things that Pickton said, it's possible that he committed as many as 49 murders. It's hard to know these things because many of his victims were Indigenous women, and many of them were sex workers. So it was hard to track these missing women and to follow up on these cases because they didn't have a lot of connections. But I think that the case of Pickton is at least an interesting contrast when we start thinking about the death penalty. In both of these cases, the crimes were extremely heinous, and there's probably no hope of improving the character of either of these people. But in the US, the method is to leave a person on death row for a very long time, fight the court cases, and eventually the state will have the go-ahead to perform the execution, whereas in Canada, for extremely heinous murders, that's not something that they ever pursue. So the Canadian method is basically for the worst murderers, we can be assured that they will spend the rest of their life in prison. It would be a good question to see whether Pickton's 26 murders, and I believe, if I remember my reading right, he was not convicted for all 26. But especially if his sentences are non-consecutive, he will most assuredly be in prison for the rest of his life. So when we start reflecting ethically about these questions, we can then begin to wonder what morality requires of us, maybe also what morality requires us not to do when we consider these cases. I don't want to draw any conclusions for you at this point. Remember, the point of getting our facts clear in practical ethics is not to bully anybody into accepting a view that they're not ready to accept, but it is important for us to work from a common ground of facts, so it doesn't just devolve into bickering about the facts. And I think that with all the information that we've looked at today, there are still arguments that could be made in favor of the death penalty and arguments that could be made against it. So, we're going to wrap up here for this. I will be asking all of you maybe to fill this out in our Zoom discussion or on the discussion board. But yeah, I'd be interested especially to hear what you think was left out, or if you could like learn one fact, if you could ask science to help you settle one question about the death penalty and its nature, it would be a worthwhile thing to think about what kind of question, upon learning the answer, would be decisive for helping us to settle the question about whether it's morally permissible to administer the death penalty. So that's that for this discussion of facts on the ground. We'll transfer into our first argumentative piece by Igor Primarats, and he'll be arguing in favor of the death penalty. So we'll pick things up there, and keep up the good hard work, folks. Okay, take care. Bye.